Imagine England run by a teenager using flowcharts, target lists, and administrative orders. Not a poet, not a romantic hero, but an institutional architect obsessed with order, standardization, and centralized power. Sounds implausible? That was Edward VI. He was not merely the short-lived king cherished as the treasure of the realm. He was the prototype of a hard-edged state model, highly efficient but with little tolerance. Had he lived longer, England might have taken a very different path. In this section, we lift the mask of the frail boy king. Most popular accounts frame Edward VI as a 15-year-old victim, born into the Tudor glow, dead in sickness. That's true, but incomplete. Our lens, Edward as a young institutional designer, someone who saw kingship as a project to be standardized, optimized, and controlled. Rather than dwell on personal tragedy, we examine how he thought about the state, standardizing religious oaths, tightening discipline among officials, contracting foreign policy to secure the home front, and above all, obsessively inspecting, measuring, and fixing anything that didn't align with the blueprint in his mind. From childhood, Edward didn't just learn letters to be virtuous in the classical sense. He learned to operate power in the Reformation era, mastering language, logic, and systems thinking. In his teenage years, while many were still learning courtly manners, Edward wanted to standardize the bishop's oath, ensuring the wording matched the new line. This wasn't merely faith, it was governance technique, using legal language to shape political reality. Edward's distinction, and the reason the frail boy image can be misleading, lay in his emotional reticence, paired with traces of a mechanical mind, terse notes, concise directives, and edits to wording as if revising an instruction manual. As his body weakened, his political will sharpened, prioritizing system regulation over public sentiment. In other words, an early sketch of a technocracy ruler, low on romance, high on rules. Why open the video from this angle? Because it's the key to rereading every event that followed, from accepting a peace treaty in exchange for treasury stability, to ordering fortress inspections, to bending the succession law in an attempt to keep the Reformation's course. Agree or not, Edward's consistency lay in his aim to make the state run according to a new design, one with efficiency, discipline, and the state church at its core. And here's the hook for the rest. If a mind wired for blueprints and KPIs had sat on the throne for another 10 or 20 years, England might have become a very different version of itself. Strong in naval defense, strict in law and regulation, uncompromising in religion. Edward's early death didn't just close the chapter on a boy's tragedy, it cut short a daring political experiment. In the next sections, we'll decode that blueprint, what he learned to think this way, who acted in his stead and followed his model, why he chose the treasury over glory, and ultimately, when will clashed with succession law, why technique lost to legitimacy. Keep the skeptical spirit. We neither gild nor tarnish. We read Edward VI as an institutional designer who never had the time to grow up, and leave you to answer, was this the lucid vision of an efficient England, or the door to a rigid order that history happened to close just in time?
To understand Edward VI, we must begin not with his innate personality, but with the mold pressed upon him from his first day of life, a court obsessed with succession, order, and ritual. On 12 October 1537, the prince was born after Henry VIII had yearned for a son for 28 years. 12 days later, his mother, Jane Seymour, died from postnatal complications. From that moment, Edward became the center of a national project to keep the seed of the dynasty alive, pure, and legitimate. The court immediately constructed a closed world around him. Edward was separated from the king and raised in a royal nursery, overseen by noble ladies, headed by Lady Margaret Bryan, who had previously cared for Mary and Elizabeth. His schedule, diet, bathing, dressing, movements, all were standardized. Anyone wishing to meet the prince had to hold sufficiently high rank. Etiquette demanded kissing the hand. Attendants were forbidden from traveling to London to avoid disease. This was not merely preventative health. It was the state turning a child into a symbol, encased in a glass shield of ceremony. The opulence of this environment was both display and instrument. Edward's schoolbooks were bound in fine materials and encrusted with jewels, looking like luxury items, yet serving as manifestos of expectation. The dynasty would fashion a learned, legitimate king worthy of succession. Material splendor masked an emotional void. A mother lost early, a father kept at a distance. Henry VIII loved his son in the manner of kingship, through orders and design, rather than through time spent together. Edward learned early a lesson. In the Tudors' world, affection had to pass through the gates of ritual. Yet within this cold shell, there were rare shafts of light. For a time, Mary and Elizabeth lived near Edward. Letters show he was particularly fond of his eldest sister. These fleeting family moments reveal a child longing for connection. From them, Edward absorbed two contrasting languages of the dynasty: Mary's Catholic legitimacy and Elizabeth's humanist Reformation learning. Later, when he embraced thoroughgoing reform, the fracture in kinship became more visible. In Tudor politics, family members could also be rivals in the drama of legitimacy. The most vivid emblem of this power environment is the painting The Family of Henry VIII, 1544. Many see it as a family portrait. In truth, it was a political poster. Henry sits at the center like the sun. Jane Seymour, long dead, is inserted as the mother of the heir. Edward stands at Henry's right, in the position of succession. Mary and Elizabeth appear not out of sentiment, but because statute had restored them to the line of inheritance. The arrangement on canvas was a message to Europe. The Tudor line is stable, the succession is settled. Edward grew up before this picture as before a map of power. Everyone has a place, and that place is determined by law, not by emotion. From this environment emerged three traits that defined the political Edward. First, an obsession with rules. His life was one of timetables and ceremony, naturally breeding faith in the power of norms and legal language. Second, a sense of risk. Isolated from infancy for fear of disease, Edward developed an instinct for prevention, later reflected in orders to inspect fortresses and tighten church discipline. Third, an acute awareness of image and legitimacy. Seeing the 1544 painting daily was enough to learn that politics was a stage, and every gesture had to fit the role of perfect heir. In short, Edward did not grow up in an ordinary family. He was incubated in a chamber of power. Isolation made him procedural. Ceremony taught him to speak in clauses. Propaganda taught him to think in diagrams. Thus, when we later see a boy king revising bishop's oaths, prioritizing the treasury over glory, or trying to bend the succession law, these were not impulsive acts. They were the trajectory set from the cradle. And this is why, in judging Edward, we must look beyond the tragedy of his 15th year to see how the Tudor environment molded an institutional designer who never had the chance to grow up. To grasp how uncompromising Edward VI was with language, ritual, and the state, we must look at the laboratory that produced him, a humanist Reformation curriculum designed not to nurture a charming prince, but to program a system operator. Around the age of 6, Edward left the world of nursery comfort for the discipline of books at Hampton Court. His studies followed the new humanist model: Latin, Greek, biblical theology, classical philosophy, the art of rhetoric. The reading list was not decorative: Aesop, fable and morality; Cato, conduct; Plato, Aristotle, categorical thinking. Cicero, Quintilian, argument and persuasion. Core exercises included translation, writing themes, developing a proposition, compiling commonplaces, selecting striking phrases or ideas, and engaging in counter-argument debates. The essential skill was not rote memory, but turning ideas into verbal order. His key tutors were explicit about their aims. Richard Cox, a Latin tutor and staunch reformer, built Edward's doctrinal spine: the supremacy of Scripture, rejection of papal authority, discipline in personal and communal life. John Cheek, Regius Professor of Greek, imparted both mastery of classical texts and the habit of tracing words to their roots, a kind of word dissection that sharpened precision of thought. This environment did more than teach letters, it anchored faith, a national church, vernacular liturgy, divine authority under royal authority. The results are visible in surviving drafts of his schoolwork. Edward wrote essays against papal supremacy, even attempting French compositions to train for debate beyond England's borders. This was not teenage impulse, it was deliberate training. He was learning to wield words as political tools, statutes, oaths, proclamations, devices that would later become the young king's levers of governance. School discipline was as unyielding as stone. In that era, the rod was a means of shaping the will. Living to a strict timetable, repeating exercises by set procedure, Edward absorbed a reflex. Problem equals deviation from the norm. Solution, adjust wording, standardize process. Later, his chronicle, spare, cold, focused on events rather than feelings, reveals that words had been wired into his thinking, to record, to classify, to decide. One oft-mentioned and debated detail, his childhood interest in astrology or magic. In a Renaissance context, astrology was not cheap superstition. It was part of scholarly knowledge. If anything, this curiosity hints at Edward's investigative attitude toward knowledge. The world runs by laws, laws that can be read, interpreted, and applied to governance. The central point here is how education transformed into politics. Rhetoric was not just about public speaking, it trained him to arrange words so they bound reality. Thus, when Edward demanded that a bishop's oath be altered, it was both a religious act and a legal technique. Change the wording to change the power. When he bristled at officials ignoring directives, it was not adolescent petulance. It was the defense of a sentence structure he believed would make the state run smoothly. Another layer. Classical philosophy instilled habits of classification: orthodox, heterodox, lawful, unlawful. In a realm breaking from Rome, such binaries proved handy for implementing reform, standardizing liturgy, administration, and ideology alike. Humanism taught verbal agility. The Reformation set a clear theological goal. Together they fused into a king who was both technocrat and doctrinaire. In sum, education programmed Edward on 3 levels. 1. Language as leverage. 2. Rules as the antidote to disorder. 3. Legitimacy packaged in documents. From this foundation, every major decision, making peace to save the treasury, inspecting fortresses, revising oaths, and finally designing succession, bears the imprint of that training. Rewrite the text to rewrite the world. And that is why, in telling Edward's story, we should not only ask what he believed, but how he defined it, in clauses, statutes, and formal structures.
January 1547. Henry VIII dies, and a 9-year-old boy wears the crown amid a religious political storm far from settled. On paper, England would be governed by a regency council. In reality, Edward Seymour, the king's maternal uncle, brother to the late Queen Jane Seymour, swiftly consolidated power, assumed the title of Lord Protector, and built his government around a blunt principle: order first, debate later.
Somerset's order was enforced by the sword. In the north, he extended the so-called rough wooing with Scotland, contemporaries' mocking term for the campaign to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, to Edward, locking the border with a marriage treaty. In practice, this meant scorched earth raids, fortress after fortress. At home, Somerset pressed forward with Protestant reform while trying to stabilize prices and land tenure in the face of inflation and enclosure, which were biting hard into the lives of the poor. He relied on his status as the little king's man, and that confidence made him slow to heed counsel. But the Regency's crisis began within the Seymour family itself. Thomas Seymour, Somerset's younger brother, sought a shortcut to power by playing with both affection and money, secretly giving Edward gifts to win favor, hastily marrying the widowed Queen Catherine Parr, and making advances toward Princess Elizabeth. It was not merely distasteful, it was a challenge to legitimacy. The breaking point came when Thomas was caught sneaking into the royal apartments at night. The affair ended under the executioner's blade. Somerset, to keep his own seat, signed his brother's death warrant, a decision consistent with his order first creed, but also the first fracture in his moral authority. By 1549, fractures widened into chasms. Two major rebellions erupted simultaneously. Kett's rebellion in Norfolk, driven by peasant anger over enclosure and economic pressure, and the Prayer Book Rebellion in the West Country, where Catholics raged against the English Book of Common Prayer replacing Latin liturgy. These were not merely about religion or bread. They were chain reactions when the government's blueprint collided with ingrained customs, language, and belief. Edward VI's view of these events reveals his mind. In the Chronicle, his terse personal record, the uprisings are noted in ledger style, on which day they were suppressed, where, and with what result for the king's forces. No lament, no sympathy, just bullet points. For a teenager to see rebellion as a troop movement problem may chill modern readers, but placed in the technocratic discipline frame formed since childhood, it was reflex, identify deviation, deploy force, restore the standard. Meanwhile, Somerset was losing ground as he fought on multiple fronts. He tried to balance religious reform to satisfy intellectuals and Protestants, economic concessions to placate the poor, and strict order to maintain the crown's dignity. But each goal pulled in different directions. At the top, nobles bristled at his centralization and sidelining of the council. At the bottom, the people saw the costs of reform in their fields, churches, and markets. In between sat a king in his early teens, learning to sign, amend, and critique official papers, and learning quickly. If one idea sums up the Somerset era, it is that the machinery used a sledgehammer to drive nails. Good commands on paper turned contradictory in the field. Liturgical reform passed by statute but without cultural cushioning. Land policy preached equity but collided with elite interests. Foreign campaigns thundered but emptied the treasury. Somerset believed central power could pull the whole realm onto a new track in one stroke. England replied with revolt. For Edward VI, this was his first political education, delivered in live fire. He watched an adult governing in his name wield the same order-first language he himself was about to internalize and pay the price. The impression left? That authority must pair with the craft of persuasion, that documents are not enough without legitimacy, and that, when necessary, the crown will secure stability by force. That lesson would follow Edward into the next chapter, when Somerset fell and the young king began to place his own hand on the machinery, colder, faster, and, in his own eyes, more logical. By late 1549, after a summer of rebellion and repression, Edward Seymour's seat as Lord Protector was badly shaken. The council, exhausted by war, financial disarray, and his autocratic style, closed ranks against him. In October 1549, Somerset took the young king and fled to Windsor for safety, but the move only pushed him further from his colleagues. He was arrested, then temporarily released in early 1550, attempting to regain a place at the center of power. By the end of 1551, however, a fresh conspiracy charge sealed his fate. On 22nd January 1552, Somerset was beheaded on Tower Hill. For many reigns, such an event would have meant merely a change of regent. For Edward VI, it was a system shift, from being managed by others to shaping management himself. The key point was not only who replaced Somerset, John Dudley, rising from Earl of Warwick to Duke of Northumberland, but that the tempo of power behind the throne changed. In the first 2 years of the regency, the political voice was that of a guardian. After Somerset's fall, that voice increasingly bore Edward's tone. Concise orders, clear standards, a preference for intervention by written instruction. Between the ages of 13 and 15, the king began turning the written word into a steering wheel. We see this in 3 layers of action. First layer, language and ritual. Edward scrutinized institutional wording with care. A striking example is the oath of Bishop John Hooper. Elements with a sacred flavor were removed to align with Reformation theology and the New Order. For Edward, changing a single word in an oath was not symbolic. It shifted the axis of authority from Rome to royal supremacy. He was following exactly the lesson of Section 3, rewrite the text to rewrite the world. Second layer, discipline over officials. After 1551, letters of reprimand, reminders, and demands for explanation became more frequent. Officials who delayed implementing religious or financial directives were named outright. Localities that neglected order were told to correct it immediately. This was not adolescent petulance, but the logic of someone used to working with templates and deadlines. There are standards, there is oversight, and there are consequences for deviation. It was a rule by orders mentality, not merely rule by man. Third layer, the king's image. The 1551 portrait, often attributed to Gwilym Scroats, shows Edward standing upright, hand resting on a sword hilt, no longer the child clutching an orb. The new image matched the new government. A king stepping into the role of helmsman, with Dudley, unlike Somerset, skilled at using the young king's will rather than concealing it. Dudley could not monopolize power as Somerset had, the council was wary. His practical solution was to rely on Edward's signature and decisiveness to legitimize his moves. The two formed a functional alliance. Dudley handled the political machinery, trading influence, calculating factions. Edward supplied policy direction, standardized religion, administrative discipline, treasury priorities. Compared with Henry VIII at a similar stage of rule, an interesting difference emerges. Henry was the personality-driven type, volatile, shifting course on impulse and personal passion. Edward was the codified version, sparing in emotion, trusting in norms and clauses. Both were resolute, but one wielded personal will, the other wielded the system of documents. Thus, when Edward wanted to settle a matter, he did not whisper threats. He amended a clause, altered an article, or issued a new order. The practical result: after 1551-52, politics revolved less around a powerful uncle and more around checklists of tasks. How to stabilize the currency, what to arrange with France to free the crown's hands at home, how to adjust the church machinery for uniform operation. The fall of Somerset was not only an internal purge, it marked a shift from personal regency to a procedural state, at least in the young king's aspiration. Of course, this should not be romanticized. Edward was still a teenager in a court full of seasoned operators. But from this point onward, each major decision bore an increasingly clear imprint of his own thinking. This set the stage for what followed: accepting peace for the sake of money over glory, personally auditing fortresses and ports, and ultimately redesigning the succession law to fit his vision of a Reformation England, even at the cost of colliding with the wall of legitimacy.
When John Dudley slid from Earl of Warwick to Duke of Northumberland,
and took the helm of government, he did not inherit a kingdom at ease. He received a machine hot to the touch, a protracted war, a shredded treasury, a debased currency, and an administration cracked by the rebellions of 1549. Unlike Somerset, who believed in the sledgehammer of power, Northumberland read the problem as a triangle of diplomacy, finance, coastal defense, and chose a strategy less glorious but more pragmatic: pull back to consolidate within. Diplomacy: swallow pride to buy time and money. The turning point was the peace treaty with France/Scotland, 1550. England withdrew from Boulogne, took a large cash payment, and closed the war dossier to stop the treasury's bleeding. Yes, it was humiliating to the war party, relinquishing a bridgehead many saw as a symbol of national prestige, but from a state treasury viewpoint, Dudley purchased two intangible assets. 1. Time for internal reform. 2. The ability to rebuild financial credibility with a lump sum infusion rather than vague promises of future glory. The planned interdynastic marriage, which later fell through, further showed his priority: reduce external friction to keep hands free for domestic repair. Finance: patch the holes before dreaming big. First step: cut war losses and rein in court spending. Next, sell off assets, crown lands, and arrange credit with merchants to ride out the cash squeeze. The crucial measure, less romantic than a battlefield victory, was restoring monetary standards, halting the debasement of precious metals in the coinage, a legacy of earlier years, and moving toward reminting at a more stable standard. A less porous currency cooled prices, reassured merchants, and, most importantly, gave the state a calculable base. The most urgent expenses, troop pay, garrisons, provisioning, could only be managed if the currency wasn't bleeding value daily. Of course, there was no financial miracle. Dudley's government still had to sell more and borrow more to buy breathing room, but the difference lay in presentation. Fewer promises of conquest, more emphasis on stability, budgeting, discipline. In letters of reprimand, Edward, now increasingly on the wheel himself, pressed officials to follow templates, submit ledgers, report grain stocks, disburse funds on schedule. Rule by orders extended straight into public finance. Naval defense and fortifications: lock the door before fixing the house. With the South Coast as an open gateway, the priority was the shoreline. Edward's on-site audit mindset, explored in Section 7, met Dudley's need. Inventory cannon, repair fortresses, organize magazines. These were not grand campaigns, but long inspection lists: where walls cracked, what calibers of guns were lacking, which stores were damp, which harbors were silted. If Somerset had liked men and fire, this phase was about engineers and spreadsheets. Naval defense was not for imperial expansion, but to seal the water's edge and reduce the odds of a big blaze while the treasury was recovering. Domestic politics: a functional alliance between Dudley and the young king. After Somerset's fall, the council was alert to any monopolization of power. Dudley could not be the lord and master his predecessor had been. His way forward was to stand in step with Edward, take the king's signature, the king's orders, the king's standardized wording as the legal engine to push policy. Edward gained room to hone his text-based state. Dudley had the royal backing to negotiate and pressure in council. The result was a less flamboyant government, but one that got things done. The drawbacks and the cost: the peace that traded prestige for cash bred resentment. Selling assets and borrowing were painkillers, not cures. Structural revenues, steady taxation, increased production had yet to grow. Restoring the coinage standard could cause short-term shock. Prices, wages, and debts had to realign, and the weakest bore the brunt. And at a deeper level, the drive to accelerate religious standardization, new service books, new oaths, brought administrative cohesion, but added pressure on communities still attached to older rites, a latent spark for unrest. If Northumberland's strategy were graded on a short-term, long-term scale, the verdict would be short-term achieved, bleeding stopped, currency stabilized, borders quiet, administration disciplined. Long-term, uncertain, still reliant on asset sales and credit reputation, while production and taxation remained insufficiently restructured. But it was precisely in this short-term quiet that Edward had the chance to push the technocratization of the state, from the wording of an oath to the way a fortress was repaired. And that foundation set up the next two moves: on-site naval audits, Section 7, and a strike at the succession law, Section 9, the clearest expression of the young king's maxim to change the text to change the world.
After extinguishing the war through a peace treaty and patching the treasury, Section 6, Edward VI undertook something that might sound ceremonial but was in reality highly technocratic: the royal progress of summer 1552 along the southern coast. For many monarchs, a progress was a grand tour to display power. For Edward, it was an on-site audit, going straight to where tax revenue was turning into stone walls, cannons, and powder magazines, checking the blueprint in his head against the brick and earth before him. He pursued three objectives in parallel. First, to inventory defensive assets: walls, moats, foundations, gun platforms, fields of fire, the number of cannons in service or dismounted, whether powder stores were dry, casks intact, whether garrisons had enough men for full shifts. Second, to standardize procedure, requiring uniform record-keeping, each fortress to maintain its own checklist for arms, ammunition, and provisions, regular maintenance schedules, named officers signing off on responsibility. Third, to prioritize investment. In the face of tight funds, deciding what to repair immediately, what could wait, which guns to rebore, which to replace, which harbors to dredge first for faster resupply. A symbolic stop was Portsmouth, the strategic mouth of the Tudor navy. Edward did not view the port as a picturesque scene. He saw it as a logistical choke point: channel depth, safe anchorages, magazine placement, supply routes from the hinterland. He scrutinized Southsea Castle and the coastal forts, where gun placements no longer suited the range of newer artillery, where dead angles left firing gaps, which damp walls risked spoiling powder, which towers were beautiful but useless against cannon fire. His conclusion was blunt: some forts were obsolete or misplaced. They must be rebuilt. Orders came with deadlines: realign walls, open embrasures to match proper calibers, raise magazine floors to prevent damp, remove decorative structures to clear space for firepower. At the system level, Edward wanted to turn the string of coastal forts into a synchronized machine. Instead of each site in its own style, he pushed for standardized calibers, ammunition, and powder charges to reduce waste and avoid supply breakdowns. Uniform inventory ledgers, so that in case of redeployment, lead times could be calculated. This was pure engineer project manager thinking: standard, checklist, accountable person, completion deadline. He also paid attention to manpower, ensuring enough soldiers were on watch, that gunners drilled to set routines, that officers could read procedural charts rather than relying on vague experience. For Edward, a strong fortress was not just thick walls, it was thick procedure. Why did this approach matter? First, it matched the pull back to grow strong strategy.
if not racing to expand, then seal the coastline tight to lower the risk of a major fire. Second, it translated an abstract vision, a technocratic state, into concrete items, a brick, a cannon, a powder cask, a ledger page. Third, it enforced connected discipline between crown and locality. Instead of slogans, frontline positions received measurable orders: magazine humidity, number of gunnery drills per month, minimum stockpile levels. In terms of image, Edward also sent a message: the king personally inspects the work, not just signs the paper. Naturally, no single journey could work miracles. In the short term, the main benefit was identifying bottlenecks and ranking priorities. Fix immediately what was cheap and brought quick gains. Keep costly sites in safe maintenance mode. In the medium term, had Edward lived a few more years to oversee it, one might have seen a coastal network of forts, magazines, and supply ports running on checklists, standardized calibers, and fixed maintenance schedules. A system that would make any invader think twice before crossing the channel. In the long term, such thinking could extend into other domains: taxation, currency, the church, all engineered through standards and templates. An intriguing detail: in rare letters to close friends, Edward revealed the professional satisfaction of a man inspecting inventory more than the romance of martial glory. He saw beauty in a supply graph, in an embrasure design meeting firing standards, in a dry magazine and a short resupply route. This image clashes with the sickly boy king trope. Here was an administrator in muddy boots, pencil in hand, marking red lines through what did not match the plan. In sum, the royal progress of 1552 was Edward's field test for his philosophy of rule. Change the text to change the world only works when the text touches the ground. At Portsmouth and along the southern coast, he showed he understood that. Measure, count, standardize, repair. Less fireworks, more efficiency. And that trajectory led directly to the next two steps: continuing to standardize the state's hard side, forts, treasury, and then attempting to standardize the future itself by intervening in the succession law. The boldest move of an institutional designer who never had time to grow up.
After the phase of on-site auditing and tightening the machinery of government, Edward's body began to betray its owner. In 1551, a wave of sweating sickness swept through court, claiming several of his childhood friends. In April 1552, Edward contracted measles. He seemed to recover, but his already thin immune defenses were left hollowed out. By early 1553, a cough set in and would not relent. In February, it worsened. By March, he was visibly emaciated. In April came hemorrhages, vomiting of black-green fluid, and doctors recorded putrid lungs, the contemporary term, now generally attributed to tuberculosis or secondary infection. In May, he seemed to rally, then declined rapidly. Records describe a body swollen, ulcerated, in constant pain, utterly at odds with a mind still clear and focused. What stands out is this: the weaker Edward grew, the sharper his political priorities became. If his life's philosophy had been change the text to change the world, then now, when the biological world was about to collapse, he poured everything into one ultimate text: the future of the crown. At 15, Edward understood perfectly the rules of the Tudor game. Authority was not only sword and seal, it was legitimacy packaged in law and will. And here lay the central conflict of this chapter. The young king's reformist will collided with the legal framework set down by his father, Henry VIII. Under Henry's acts of succession and his will, the order ran Edward, Mary, Elizabeth.
But in Edward's eyes, preserving the gains of the Reformation meant Mary, a devout Catholic, was a gateway back to Rome. Elizabeth, though religiously closer, carried legal risk, as the legitimacy of a woman on the throne was still contested, and she was famously unyielding, offering no guarantee she would stay the course as he wished. In short, religious conviction and legal gender prejudice combined to push Edward to another option, which Section 9 will reveal. By now, the palace was half infirmary, half war room. Tudor medicine was powerless. Fumigations, bleedings, herbal powders, none could defeat the lung disease. In adjoining chambers, counselors soothed the public while sealing off information to prevent a scramble for power. Rumors, never in short supply in London, ranged from poison to witchcraft, yet even Edward's enemies knew illness was the true sovereign in the palace. The real race was over paper. Who could get the king to sign, and sign before his strength failed? In his chronicle, Edward still recorded events like an accountant: which day he consulted physicians, which day he received ambassadors, which day he signed orders. This cold style chills later readers, yet within his own frame of reference, it was keeping standards to the last breath. As his breathing shortened, his entries thickened on one theme: succession. He discussed with advisors mechanisms to exclude those legally entitled under current law. He sought to legitimize a new choice by writing it differently, hoping different words would make a different reality. Here, all the motifs from sections 1 through 7 converged: language, procedure, standardization, discipline, now applied to designing the future. Outside the sick room, legitimacy exerted its own gravitational pull. Mary had direct Tudor blood and was seen by public opinion as the rightful heir in law and filial duty. After years of turmoil, the nobility feared nothing more than a civil war over legal claims. Any plan that deviated from Henry's will needed a grand reason. Religion was that reason, but whether it was grand enough to overcome law and popular sentiment was another matter. Thus, the crux of this chapter is not merely a deathbed scene. It is the question, can will rewrite legitimacy? And if so, who will believe it? On July 1st, 1553, Edward made his last public appearance, a gaunt figure that silenced the crowd. On July 6th, 1553, he died, aged 15. The court concealed the news for several days to finalize the succession documents, the last move of an institutional designer trying to summon the future with a signature. But from that moment, everything left his hands, falling into the arena of legitimacy, where law, public sentiment, and power would fight it out. In Section 9, we will see exactly what he wrote in his succession design, and why that design, meticulous in wording, still could not overcome the pull of legitimacy.
When his body collapsed, early 1553, Edward poured all his remaining energy into a single document: the succession. This draft, commonly known as "my device for the succession," was the young king's highest attempt to keep the Reformation's course by law, true to the change the text to change the world philosophy that had shaped him since childhood. Edward's logic was straightforward: to protect a Protestant national church, Mary, a committed Catholic, must be barred from the throne. Elizabeth, though closer in religion, carried another risk: the contested legitimacy of a female monarch, and, more than that, her reputation for unbending principle, offering no guarantee she would stay on track as Edward wished. So he rerouted the line of succession to the branch of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's younger sister, not Mary I, placing his bet on Lady Jane Grey, the Protestant granddaughter of Mary Tudor, well-educated and notably newly married to John Dudley's son. Here, Edward's religious aim overlapped perfectly with Dudley's power calculus. Technically, the first version of the device excluded both Mary and Elizabeth, granting the crown to the heirs male of Lady Jane Grey, because Edward did not want a woman to rule. But time was running out. Jane had no son, and the king was running out of days. In his own hand, he amended it to read Lady Jane Grey and her heirs male. In plain terms, Edward broke his own male succession rule to save the larger goal, blocking Mary. From that point, the court raced to formalize the device, drafting letters patent to enshrine the succession per the king's wishes, gathering signatures from counselors and judges. Those who hesitated were reassured that the next parliament would ratify it, making the device law. Yet Edward was ramming against two walls. First, Henry VIII's will and the acts of succession had set the order in black letter: Edward, Mary, then Elizabeth. In the Tudor system, legitimacy weighed like lead. Anyone who sought to alter it needed a constitutional reason and parliament behind them. Second, the mood of the public and the local nobility, those who could actually raise troops, was largely in Mary's favor as the lawful heir. The device was thus a beautiful design in will, but lacking legal pillars and social foundations. Still, the machine rolled forward. On July 6, 1553, Edward died. The news was concealed for several days while the paperwork was finished. On July 10th, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen in London, but this project of engineering the future hit the gravitational pull of legitimacy. In the East, Mary swiftly rallied nobles and towns. Counties and boroughs swore to her, not out of love for her policies, but because she was lawful under Henry's will. John Dudley, to cut off Mary's advance, had to leave London with troops, a move that trapped him. Away from the capital, the Privy Council began to defect. In 9 short days, Jane's regime had the throne, the seal, and the paperwork, but lacked force and broad recognition. As the message, "Mary is the lawful queen," spread like fire, the London Council switched sides. On July 19, 1553, Mary was proclaimed Queen Mary I. Dudley was arrested at Cambridge. Jane was imprisoned in the Tower of London. The device, meticulous in its wording, shattered under 2 blows: Henry's law and social consensus. By February 1554, after Wyatt's rebellion, Jane and her husband were executed. Dudley had met the same fate earlier. The will to rewrite the law lost to tradition and legitimacy. The essence of this chapter is not simply Jane's 9 days, the clickbait tale of many a YouTube thumbnail. It is a stress test of Edward's governing philosophy. How far ahead of society can a text run? Edward had pushed it to the edge, forcing lawyers to sign the patent, persuading the council, installing a successor rational in religion and technocracy. But the Tudor system replied with its old formula: law first, as established, then policy; legitimacy first, then technique. The concise verdict: the device was both the peak and the limit of Edward VI as an institutional designer. He had proven that documents could turn many things: oaths, liturgy, the treasury, fortresses. But for the crown itself, the document was only the starting line. Victory belonged to the side that commanded law, force, and allegiance. In Section 10, we will attempt to build a scenario. If the device had prevailed, if Jane had kept the crown, what would Edward's England have looked like?
If we lay all the pieces from the previous sections on the table, the standardized text mindset, fiscal prioritization, on-site audits, obsession with order, we can sketch an Edward version of England along 4 axes: religion, military naval defense, finance economy, and state administration. Religion, a strictly state-controlled church. Edward was no mystic, he was a liturgy engineer. Had he lived another 10 to 20 years, he would likely have locked in the English language liturgy, standardized clerical oaths, and cut out elements deemed noisy to Protestant theology. The spirit was minimal tolerance for deviations, ritual differences treated as technical errors to be corrected. A Puritan-style social ethic might have emerged early, emphasizing discipline, labor, and restraint, at the cost of eroding tolerance for both Catholics and more moderate Protestant strands. Military naval defense, sealing the shoreline, building a gun belt.
Section 7 already showed Edward preferred checklists over fireworks, a plausible scenario standardizing gun calibers, ammunition store procedures, maintenance schedules, turning the coastal fortress chain into a compatible, easily supplied system. Naval development would prioritize logistics over glory, deep harbors, dry magazines, repair yards, ordnance ledgers. Less glamorous, but raising the cost of attack for any foe. With that base, England could achieve pragmatic deterrence earlier, reducing the need for showpiece battles. Finance economy, a chief accountant state. After stabilizing the coinage, Edward had the discipline to go further. Budgets based on real estimates, tighter reins on waste, transparent ledgers at the local level. Economically, signs point to him favoring market coordination over laissez-faire, standardizing weights and measures, tightening tax records, promoting workshops, ports tied to defense. The closest image is a workshop state, using contracts, tenders, and technical standards to pull private investment toward public goals, yet ready to intervene heavily when deviations appeared. But every scenario meets resistance. In 16th century England, Parliament and the local nobility were not blank paper. They guarded privileges and succession law. The market would also react. Over-tightening could break commercial incentive. Abroad, Europe was a chessboard of Habsburg, Valois, Scotland, Ireland. Any gun belt program needed real money and quiet years. Commodities history rarely grants. So where might the balance lie? Scenario A, hardline. England edges toward Prussia before Prussia. Strict religion, iron discipline, military, navy, state-led economy, high efficiency, low tolerance. Scenario B, technocratic moderation. Edward learns Somerset's lesson on legitimacy and Dudley's on the treasury, slows forced pace, keeps standards but persuades more deftly, an efficient state with political softness. Whichever path, Edward's intellectual legacy is clear. He accelerated the notion that a state could run on standards, ledgers, directives, not just the ruler's personality. The upside, an administration that measures. The downside, when standards weigh heavier than people, society loses its breathing room. In the end, the open question to you: was Edward VI a lucid technocratic reformer or an autocrat who never grew up? Perhaps both seeds lay within him, and history cut the branch before the tree cast full shade. If you find this perspective useful, hit like so the algorithm prioritizes serious history content, share with fellow Tudor enthusiasts, and subscribe, plus turn on the bell so you don't miss the next part, Lady Jane Grey, 9 Days at the Summit and the Fall of Legitimacy. Comment below whether you choose scenario A or B. I'll read them all and respond to the sharpest insights in the next video.